Thank you for joining us at such an early hour. I'm Jennifer Schenker. I'm the editor-in-chief of The Innovator, a magazine about digital transformation. I'm very pleased to be here this morning with Scott Aronson, a professor of computer science at the University of Texas in Austin, and Jeremy O'Brien, who is a physicist, researcher, and entrepreneur, founder of a company called PSIQ that hopes to bring quantum computing to commercial fruition earlier than anticipated. So we're here this morning to talk about quantum computing. Whenever a new technology is introduced that promises to transform industry, it gets executives worried. No one wants to be left behind. And this is particularly true with quantum computing because it does represent a step change. And consultants are telling businesses that first movers could have a very significant advantage over those companies that hold back and don't experiment early enough with the technology. So what we're hoping to do in this session this morning is to talk about what is quantum computing, when it might actually become commercial, which sectors will be impacted first, and what you should be doing now. So with that, I'm going to open up with you, Scott, and ask in what area do you think quantum computing will impact business first?
Sure. So there are a few big applications that we know about, and the applications are really more specialized in nature than a lot of people would like. But the biggest ones that we know about are, first of all, the simulation of quantum mechanics itself. That was the original application that physicist Richard Feynman suggested in the early 1980s when he proposed the idea of a quantum computer. And that actually is used in everything from predicting the structure of a protein to designing drugs that bind to a receptor in the right way, to designing new materials, new superconductors, new ways to make fertilizer. There's all kinds of problems in chemistry and material science where a quantum computer would really just give you a new telescope, or a new instrument to understand nature at that scale. And there may not be a direct line from that to some life-saving drug or something, but every time our ability to understand nature has increased, we've been able to use it for things. And certainly there are many chemistry problems of great practical significance, where a quantum computer might be able to help. Now, the other big, huge speed up that you can get from quantum computers, and the discovery that really put quantum computing on most people's radar in the first place, was a discovery 25 years ago by a guy named Peter Shor, that if you built a fully scalable, sort of error-corrected quantum computer, and we can get back to what that means, but suffice it to say, we are not there yet, and no one knows when we will be there. But if you could do that, then you could use it to break almost all of the encryption that is currently used to protect the internet. Okay, now this is because the encryption that we use, for example, anytime you order something online, you send your credit card number, it's all protected by a few very specific encryption systems that are based on the believed hardness of some mathematical problems, like finding the prime factors of huge numbers, or a few other problems. And these problems have a lot of structure that makes them very useful for cryptography, but also Peter Shor was able to exploit to give a quantum algorithm to solve those problems. Okay, and then beyond that, there's a much larger class of applications that that you'll hear about all the time when you hear about quantum computing. People talk about applications to AI, to machine learning, to optimization, big data, all of those things. Now, it is crucial to understand that the speed up that we expect from a quantum computer for these applications is much more modest than it is for the other applications that I talked about. Okay? So for those sort of applications, we expect typically that you could solve the problems in about the square root of the amount of time that a classical computer would need. So that is very significant. That could increase capabilities, but it is not an exponential speed up, right? It's not doing something with like n scaling or n squared scaling that classically would take 2 to the n power scaling, okay? And then there are probably other applications yet to be discovered. You know, just 2 years ago, I came up with a new application that has to do with generating random numbers and proving to a skeptic that you really did generate them randomly, which could be used for proof-of-stake cryptocurrencies, for example. And that one, notably, might already be practical with the type of devices that, for example, Google has built and that others are racing to build now. Okay, but anyway, those are a few of the main application areas that we know about.
Thanks. So
Sure.
let me turn to you now, Jeremy. And so, you know, there is a lot of confusion because back in October, there was a lot of news stories about Google and NASA achieving quantum supremacy in an experiment they did, where they claimed that they were able to do in, I think it was like 200 seconds, what it would normally take a normal computer like 100,000 years to do. But
10,000, yeah.
And there are some big corporates who are saying that they're already applying quantum computing to things like optimization of traffic routes, et cetera. Is that real quantum computing, or, you know, what should we make of these news stories?
Yeah, so the announcement of quantum supremacy was a super exciting scientific milestone, I would say. I think Scott has previously said that it's as significant as the discovery of the Higgs boson, and I think that's a pretty reasonable assessment of the scientific importance of that. It's really showing unequivocally for the first time the power of a quantum computer to outperform a conventional computer. So that's very exciting. The term supremacy was coined by a brilliant colleague of ours, John Preskill at Caltech, and I think it's slightly questionable, the terminology, but that's not really worth arguing too much about, in the sense that it does not say anything about the usefulness of that. And in fact, we're still very much looking for applications for this type of so-called quantum supremacy with these small-scale, often called noisy intermediate scale quantum, or NISQ for short, systems. And that's another Preskillism, this idea of NISQ, which is a sort of catch-all for the hope that with these small-scale systems we can find something useful to do. And some of the applications that Scott mentioned, like factoring and digital simulation, are applications that we really don't expect to be able to do with those small-scale NISQ systems. And so I think that's the challenge at the moment for this category, is to make sure that we're setting realistic expectations as to what's possible, because the full promise of quantum computing will almost certainly not be delivered by these small-scale NISQ systems. And whether anything at all will really be delivered by these small-scale NISQ systems is an open question. And I guess as time goes on, we might get a bit more pessimistic. So for me, the real excitement in quantum computing is large-scale error-corrected systems where all of the applications that Scott mentioned are accessible categorically, and some of them, like molecular simulation, we have concrete recipes for exactly how to use a large-scale error-corrected system for implementing those applications. So that's, I think, a good point to make sure that we're really calibrated in our expectations in this industry as to what's possible and what's not.
So a lot of future applications for fourth industrial revolution technologies like autonomous cars and so forth do need more computing power. But if I understand you correctly, what you're saying is it's not clear yet whether quantum computing will be able to significantly speed up computing for those applications.
I think there's a combination of things. There's applications like Scott mentioned where where there's a known exponential or strongly expected exponential advantage, like factoring for decryption, and like molecular simulation, where we have the algorithms and we know how to implement those things on a large-scale error-corrected quantum computer, which means of order 1 million qubits. And then there are other applications where we get a quadratic speedup, which could be hugely advantageous practically. And then there are things that are much more speculative, where we don't really know the outcome. So, and then in addition to the nature of the problem, there's the scale of the system, the quantum computing system that you're using in order to implement that. And by and large, it's large-scale error-corrected systems that we know how to use for useful applications. And there's some speculation that these small-scale systems could be useful.
But you mentioned claims to already be using quantum computers for traffic optimization and stuff like that. So maybe I should just briefly address that. I think these are applications where we don't even know, once you have a full scalable quantum computer, what kind of advantage you get. And there is a huge amount in this field of people just going and doing something on a quantum computer in order to say that they did it on a quantum computer, right? Not because there is any advantage whatsoever to doing it that way, okay? And you have to be extremely cautious about that. Okay?
I think it's also worth noting that for each business application, first of all, the hardware has to be fully developed. It also has to be cheap enough to be used in a commercial environment, and software has to be developed for the specific application. You can't just plug in a quantum computer and then solve your problem, right? So that's something that businesses should be aware of. But let's go back to the cryptography issue. So, if quantum computing in the near term or midterm could break present-day encryption, what should businesses be doing about that now?
Okay. Well, there is already a push to migrate to what are called post-quantum encryption systems, or quantum-resistant encryption systems. So, for example, NIST in the U.S. Has been holding a competition to try to converge on standards for post-quantum cryptography, which would be the first step in taking all of our web browsers and all of our routers and and migrating them to those encryption systems. So, it's very important to understand that Shor's algorithm, this great theoretical discovery in quantum computing from the 90s, does not say that a quantum computer could quickly break all encryption. Okay? It says that it can break the specific kinds of encryption that we happen to use to secure the internet right now. Okay, so that's bad enough. Okay, but we already have, the good news is that we already have some pretty strong candidates for crypto systems that we think would be hard to break even with a quantum computer. I mean, none of this is proven. It's very hard in theoretical computer science to prove that no algorithm or no fast algorithm will ever be discovered to do something, right? And that's also true with classical algorithms. Okay, but there are crypto systems for which people have tried to design quantum algorithms to break them for the last 20 years, and they've not been able to. The best known class are what are called lattice-based encryption systems. And these are already somewhat practical. I think Google has done some real-world tests of these systems. And I think we could migrate. And then the question is, well, is there any urgency to doing that, right? Well, I think it would be a reasonable supposition that there are intelligence agencies that are already vacuuming up data in order that they could decrypt it later once a quantum computer becomes available. And so if someone had secrets that they wanted to keep secret for 20 years, for 30 years, then I might already be looking at post-quantum cryptography. And in any case, I would want, if I were running a company, I would want someone who knew something about it, and that if quantum computing looked like it was, if the full scalable quantum computing that Jeremy was talking about looked like it was coming soon, that could implement a plan to actually migrate to post-quantum encryption.
Did you want to add anything about cryptography?
Yeah, I think the other good news that I would add to everything that Scott said is that the scale of quantum computing system that we need to decrypt using Shor's algorithm is probably an order of magnitude or two larger than the scale of system that we need for some of the earliest applications, which I think is good news just because then it will become unequivocal that the power of quantum computing in this, digital error-corrected regime. So the examples that Scott talked about, simulation, for example, we're going to have them up and running probably a good while before we have to worry about decryption. And so that will hopefully provide some impetus for, getting prepared.
But I mean, maybe just to calibrate people. I mean, Google's amazing quantum supremacy experiment from a few months ago involved 53 quantum bits, 53 qubits. Right now, if you wanted to use Shor's algorithm to break the currently used encryption, the current estimates using the currently known methods of error correction involve millions of physical qubits. Okay, so it is scary. Now, it is quite possible that better error correction methods will be discovered and that those numbers will come down, but there is a huge gap between where we are now and what it would take to actually threaten encryption. People should be clear about that.
Okay, thanks. So, Jeremy, your company, is hoping to bring some sort of a commercial quantum computing solution to market earlier than others. What's different about your approach? What makes you confident that you can do this?
Yeah, I guess when we founded this company 4 or 5 years ago, we made a very contrarian bet back then, which was that probably not contrarian to Scott, but certainly to the wider industry, which was that useful quantum computing requires error correction. Therefore, you really need to be in the sort of million qubit regime, and therefore to manufacture systems like that, you really need to be in a tier 1 semiconductor computer chip foundry. And I think by contrast, the sort of rest of the industry took an approach that was more along the lines of, let's take the dozen or so qubits we've got today, scale up by an order of magnitude, a factor of 10 or so, achieve quantum supremacy, enter into this NISQ regime, and hopefully find an application or two that is useful there, and hopefully use that as a stepping stone to get into that large-scale error-corrected million qubit regime. We have done that. We've got ourselves into one of those tier 1 semiconductor fabs, and we've taken an approach that's based on photonics, so based on light. And the other approaches to quantum computing are all one way or another based on matter. So we're using photons instead of electrons, and that has a whole range of advantages, not least of which is the ability to manufacture things at scale in one of those large semiconductor fabs.
I mean, let me just add, everyone in this field who is serious agrees that error correction is where you eventually want to get, and millions of qubits. That is not contrarian, that's conventional wisdom, okay? But the question, the disagreement is, given that we're not there, what do you do now, right? Do you try for a few hundred qubits, or do you just hold out for something that's going to scale to millions?
So that's I think, a great segue into the next question, which is basically, what would you advise the companies in this audience to be doing now? Because there could be a big breakthrough anytime, but we don't know when. And if the analysts are right, those that are better prepared to and have already been experimenting with it, may have a significant advantage over those who don't have internal teams in place, don't understand how it works. So what should the people in the room be doing now?
Well, I'm an academic, so maybe I should defer to Jeremy for business advice. But I think, the first thing I would think of is just having someone on staff who understands the subject. And it's not right. There are companies, obviously, Microsoft, Google, IBM, that have gotten into this in a big way. I don't think everyone in the world has to be doing that, but I think it is something that even tech companies or biotech companies or things like that, even of a more moderate size or that are not directly competing in this space, want to be aware of, at least.
Yeah, my advice would be to hold out for those million qubits.
Okay. And should people have an internal team so that they can be checking market developments, maybe be doing some proof of concept trials?
Yeah, I think that's, to Scott's point, I think having some people internally is definitely the right thing to be doing right now.
Okay.
I mean, I think you want to beware of snake oil salesmen, right? And people who will say, "Oh, quantum computers can accelerate your business right now," without sort of stop. You always want to stop and ask, "Well, wait a minute, are you actually doing this better than a classical computer could have done the same thing?" Right? And that question is sort of what I would say differentiates the serious players in this space from the unserious ones.
Okay. And what about the way companies will use the internet going forward? I was at a technology conference recently where someone from Google was predicting that we would need to build a parallel internet and that we would end up with a quantum internet of things. What do you think about that?
So quantum computers, we should be clear, could perfectly well, be used as part of the standard internet. And in fact, the model that most people envision, at least for the near future, is that quantum computing would be a cloud service, right? In fact, there are some companies like IBM that are already trying to provide this, where, if you have one of the special applications for which you need a quantum computer, for which it helps, then you would just submit your task to the quantum computer over the internet, as classical bits, and it will send back an answer as more classical bits. Now, having said that, there is an additional separate idea of augmenting the internet itself so that you could send quantum bits, qubits, over huge distances. Okay, now that is a separate problem from quantum computing. It would have some applications, of which the best known is quantum cryptography, what's called quantum key distribution, which is an entirely different way of doing cryptography. It has sort of struggled to find a market, even though it's already practical today over, short enough distances at least. And partly because the problem itself is already very well solved by standard, encryption. So the running joke in this field is that one of the main applications of a quantum computer will be to break our current encryption and thereby create the market for quantum cryptography. Quantum giveth and quantum taketh away, right? But I would say that the quantum internet, is something that could be done, but it is sort of as specialized as the applications are for a quantum computer, I think the applications for a quantum internet look even more specialized right now. And in any case, building scalable quantum computers would not require that. It's just something that could be done in addition.
Okay. Jeremy, did you want to add anything to that?
I think, I would just amplify that. I think we do not need a quantum internet to deploy quantum computers.
Okay. Do we have questions from people in the room who might? Well, this gentleman over here.
At the risk of revealing my ignorance, would someone please explain this term, error correction?
Yeah. So, okay, maybe I'll start, and then Jeremy will error correct what I said. So the problem with qubits is that they're extremely fragile, right? The whole point of a qubit is to be in what we call a superposition of the 0 and 1 states, where you have some quantum mechanical amplitude for being a 0 and some amplitude for being a 1 at the same time, right? And you can do this, but it is very unstable in the sense that as soon as the information about whether that was a 0 or a 1 leaks out into the external world, then that leaking collapses the qubit to be either definitely 0 or definitely 1. Right? So now it's just a classical bit. So in some sense, the whole engineering problem of building a quantum computer, the reason why this is such a hard problem, is that you have to keep the qubits incredibly well isolated from their environment. Okay, this is why a lot of quantum computing architectures involve cooling the qubits down to only slightly above absolute 0, right? Because you're trying to keep them isolated. But then at the same time, the qubits have to be interacting with each other, in a precisely choreographed way. right? And that is such a hard problem that there were distinguished physicists who said, this will never work, right? You will never be able to control qubits with the sort of perfect precision, that you're talking about, and keep them perfectly isolated from their environment. So you will never get an advantage that way. Now, the big discovery in the mid-1990s that convinced most people that quantum computing could work, at least in theory, was this discovery of quantum error correction. And what it says, basically, is that there are extremely clever ways to take qubits, take the qubits that you care about, and encode them across the collective states of many physical qubits, 10, 20, 100, whatever, in such a way that even if a few of your physical qubits get lost, leak their states out to the environment, you can detect that, and then you can recover the information that you care about from the remaining qubits. Okay, so what the theory of quantum error correction showed was that in order to build a scalable quantum computer, you do not need perfect components, like perfect qubits, perfect gates. You merely need really, really good components. So way better than existed at that time, but this really made it look like this requires no new fundamental physics. This is merely a staggering many-decade engineering journey to do. And so that is really what set the agenda, I think, for experimental quantum computing research. Try to get the qubits to be at least good enough that you can then use these error correcting codes to have them simulate even better qubits, and so on until you are effectively simulating qubits that are perfect, for as much time as you would like. And so, and that's exactly what Jeremy's company, for example, is trying to do, to get to this threshold where error correction becomes a net win.
Okay. Did you want to add?
Yeah, I agree with everything Scott said. I would just also add that this is not mysterious, this error correction at the highest level, in the same way with conventional computing. If we want to protect, for example, electronics that we're sending into space, to radiation harden a conventional processor or something, we use error correction at the physical level, where we, for example, we might encode a single bit in multiple transistors, and thereby, if one of those transistors spontaneously flips its state from 0 to 1 or vice versa, we can recover the logical information. So it's the same principle, it's the same idea. It just becomes a little bit more complicated in the quantum realm due to some additional constraints on what you can and can't do in the process of detecting those errors and correcting for those errors.
I should add that Google's quantum supremacy experiment, as great a milestone as it was, it did not use any error correction whatsoever, right? It's just bare, unprotected qubits, okay? And, as long as you're not using error correction, we expect that there's going to be a very hard limit on how much you can scale up, maybe a few hundred qubits, but probably not beyond that, without using at least some error correction.
Okay. All right. Question over here.
Actually, I just wanted to understand. I had 3 simple questions.
3?
Yeah, very simple questions. One, that the present computers, do we have to throw everything out if the quantum computers are introduced? Second,
Absolutely not.
That's an easy one. No.
Yeah, no. Okay, you don't want a quantum computer for checking your email or playing Angry Birds. Okay? Trust me.
And second is it going to improve the efficiency of doing business or working? And third, is it going to be more cost effective, resulting in reducing the cost when you are doing the businesses, right, or doing any kind of activity?
Right. Well, the answer to the second and third questions is that the point is to solve certain problems that classically just would not be possible to solve at all. Like, even in some cases, even within the lifetime of the universe, right? That are just completely intractable for a classical computer to do. And so you enhance your capabilities, but, also for some problems that even a classical computer could solve, it's possible that quantum computers will, once they are really working in a scalable way, that they'll be more cost efficient, more energy efficient, just because they are using less resources to do the same thing, for the specific problems, for which they give a speed up, which is exactly what we were talking about before.
Okay. This gentleman?
If Moore's law comes to an end, let's say within this decade, and at the same time quantum computing remains a topic of the far future, at least for large-scale systems, what does it mean for the technological progress from a computer science point of view?
It's probably not great.
Yeah, I think I think Moore's law is coming to an end. The question is on what exact time frame, but it's coming to an end, and we have had decades of business and industry and human advancement that has taken as a implicit in many cases assumption that Moore's law is marching ahead. And so I think there are huge implications for that. And as Scott just said in answer to the previous question, even if quantum computing were already here, it wouldn't solve that problem, because there are a lot of applications of a conventional computer that a quantum computer won't help with. So that's a separate sort of non-quantum computing question. And then I think that actually maybe this is helpful to just zoom out for a minute. I think you should. I think it's a bit unfortunate that the quantum computing has the word computing in it, because as Scott said, we're talking, the big motivation is to address problems that would otherwise be impossible. So no one's even trying to tackle these problems. The way I try to think about it is that, quantum computing is to conventional computing what a warp drive that enables intergalactic travel is to conventional transport. So yes, it still gets you from A to B, but you're better off thinking of it as an entirely different category. I don't know how helpful that is, but I think conventional computing will continue to need to march forward, and will continue to find applications and so on. And quantum computing is an entirely different thing. So again, to the transport analogy, we didn't stop driving cars when aircraft, when supersonic aircraft were invented. It's that sort of analogy, I think.
May I add a short second question?
Sure.
Do you think maybe quantum sensing has more realistic perspectives?
That is something that, it seems clear that you can do something useful, like in radar, for example, in the near future. So that's a sort of a separate problem. I think that there will be a session somewhere in Davos about quantum sensing, if you're interested in it.
There is, yeah.
Yeah.
This gentleman over here?
Yeah, great session, by the way. So maybe both of you, Scott and Jeremy, give us a perspective, best guess, 1 million error-corrected qubits, what time frame are we talking about here?
So to make sure that we've got the question right, you're talking about 1 million physical qubits on which we perform error correction. Yeah, 1 million error-corrected qubits is well, I believe that if we can succeed in manufacturing such a system in a tier 1 semiconductor fab, as well as using the rest of the supply chain that's used to make, cell phones, laptops, and conventional high-performance computing, then that's measured in a handful of years and not decades. So.
Okay. Maybe I'm a little bit less bullish than Jeremy is here. I feel like as a field, it would be good if we under-promise and over-deliver. But in some sense, I think asking how long, it's a little bit like in the 1930s. Let's say if you ask, how long until a nuclear chain reaction, right? And the most informed people in the world, I think thought it would be many, quite a few decades, because they did not foresee, a political event, that would just massively accelerate the time frame. And I think we're sort of in a similar situation, in that, if someone were to spend $1 trillion for some reason, right, I can't say that it couldn't be done within this decade. But if if it continues along the sort of trajectory we're seeing, I see sort of first like a decade where people try to achieve applications with NISC devices, right? And where they try to do, something useful with a NISC device. And then, just the beginnings of error correction, right? Like not full recursive error correction, but just improving things a little bit. And that's a big milestone itself. And then integrating it into millions of qubits, and that starts to look further out into the future. How much further? Yeah, so if I had the skill of answering such questions, I would not be a professor, I'd be an investor.
Vikram.
Good morning. Thank you. Fascinating discussion. Scott, you touched on the efforts at NSA and NIST to come up with more difficult math problems to replace the key exchange techniques which we're using today because they're likely to be compromised. However, in quantum computing and indeed in quantum algorithms, we're very much at the infancy of both of these fields. Perhaps like we were in the 1940s with conventional computers. I'd love to hear both of your thoughts on, I think at the moment we're down to perhaps a few dozen candidate replacement algorithms for our current key exchange techniques. However, given the potential for development of new algorithms, indeed the likelihood of so, from a risk management perspective, how do you think organizations should think about using quantum-resistant algorithms?
I mean, I think that if you do cryptography, you're always living on the edge to some extent, right? Because we don't know, in the current state of computer science, we don't know how to prove rigorously that any of these things are secure, right? We can just say, well, here is the underlying mathematical problem, and it's been out there for people to solve for X number of years, and the progress has not gotten beyond this point, right? But now it's important to understand that quantum computing, I wouldn't say it's in its infancy anymore, right? Maybe it's childhood, right? The people have actually been thinking about quantum algorithms to break lattice-based crypto systems for 20, 25 years by now. Okay, and if you look at how long have people been looking for fast factoring algorithms, right? Well, okay, in some sense, the ancient Greeks were already doing that, but the biggest impetus came from the discovery of RSA and encryption in the late 1970s. So that's really only been 40 years itself, right? And so by now, there is. There has been a lot of research into these algorithms, and some of them might be broken. I mean, that is possible. The more, if you wanted to get into the details, I mean, the more structure you have in your lattice problem, like if the lattices have some additional properties, like being ideal lattices and so forth, the more structure there is, the structure is useful for cryptography, right? So it's sort of almost irresistible for cryptographers to want to put it in there because it lets you do more functionalities. But the more structure you put in, the more risk there is that a quantum algorithm will be discovered, right? So, but if you just want the most basic, like encryption and authentication, then you could do that based on very unstructured lattice problems, for which, I would say I am I would be equally surprised by a fast quantum algorithm being discovered for those algorithms for those problems as I would be by a fast classical algorithm being discovered for factoring, right? I can't say that either is impossible, but I hope that helps to calibrate you a bit.
So let me just go back to what you said earlier, because isn't it a little bit worrying that we know that some sensitive data is being vacuumed up now for decryption at some later point? Is there anything that companies can be doing now to protect that sensitive data?
Yeah. Well, I mean, certainly it's worrying. I mean, I don't really have any secrets, so I don't worry about it. But so, if I did, I would be worried. Okay, and I think the main response, if you're really worried about keeping something secret, then use quantum-resistant methods of encryption. Now, it's important for people to understand that this whole discussion we've been having about quantum computers threatening encryption is really specific to public key encryption. right, or asymmetric key encryption, okay, which is, the kind that is mostly used on the internet because it doesn't require the parties to share a secret key in advance. Okay, but if you only want secret key encryption, then we're very, very confident that that should remain secure even in a world with quantum computers. Basically that the best a quantum computer should be able to do is break those sort of systems in about the square root of the amount of time that you would have needed classically, which to calibrate you means that to get the same level of security that you had before, you would need to roughly double the length of your secret key. Which, doubling your key length is something you probably should have done anyway, right? You can do that, right? So I think for symmetric key, private key cryptography, we're pretty confident that quantum computing will have only a mild impact. And this has implications for lots of, this lets you do authentication, digital signatures in a way that's almost certainly quantum resistant. The Bitcoin ledger should have some quantum resistance for that reason. Bitcoin also uses elliptic curve encryption for something else, and that part is vulnerable to a quantum computer right now, and that part really would need to migrate to quantum secure encryption. But the main, thing of solving the proof of work, in Bitcoin, inverting the hash function, adding a new block to the blockchain, that is something where we expect that even a quantum computer will give you only this square root speed up. So, it's important to understand what specific kind of encryption you're talking about. And if it is one of the kinds that is vulnerable to a quantum attack, like RSA or Diffie-Hellman or elliptic curve cryptography, then switch, if you can, to a quantum-resistant encryption method there.
Okay. Any other questions? So then let's, as we're almost out of time, let's talk about a few key takeaways that we want to give to the audience about preparing for this new future. Can I start with you, Jeremy?
Sure. Yeah, I think there's a real prospect that quantum computing is going to be a profoundly world-changing technology. And hopefully we've discussed some ideas of where that might actually be. So Scott's already mentioned simulation for understanding proteins and pharmaceuticals, materials, room temperature superconductors, fertilizers. One of my favorite examples is a catalyst for carbon sequestration that we might be able to cheaply produce and deploy. And I think that in the future, we will look back on our pre-quantum computing world and wonder how we survived with those primitive caveman tools that we had. How far that future is an open question, but I think it's clear that for all of that list of things that quantum simulation will open up, that's about understanding the physical world. And, we inhabit a physical world, and there's no escaping that. And we really can't, we really can't get deep into it. It's the telescope that Scott said. We will never build a telescope like the one that we will build with quantum computing to access the physical world. So that will have profound implications, I think. Other applications, I think we need, that Scott mentioned, that where we don't get such a dramatic speed up, where we don't get an exponential speed up, it requires careful work to understand exactly what the implications are. I think there's cause for optimism, but there's also cause for skepticism on those things. And then I think the biggest thing for me is that we should just rein in some of the sort of hype and unrealistic expectations here. And we should really understand the difference between these small-scale noisy systems and large-scale error-corrected systems, and not conflate the applications of the latter with the reality, the realization of the former.
Yeah, so maybe I should say, I mean, since the beginning of the computer revolution, right? Every computer that we have ever seen has operated on the same fundamental principles. Okay, and with Moore's law, all that has really changed has been the numbers. So the speed of the processors, the number of parallel processors, the amount of memory you can access. Okay, but from a fundamental point of view, it has sort of all been the same stuff. It's all operated on rules that Charles Babbage understood in the 1830s, and that Alan Turing mathematically codified in the 1930s. Okay, quantum computing is the first model of computation that is really fundamentally different from that. Okay, that can, we expect can solve some problems with only, polynomial scaling of resources that classically, yes, in principle it could be done, but it would take exponential scaling of resources, right? And maybe couldn't, it would take longer than the age of the universe in many cases. Okay, so that is really fundamentally new. For me, this would be well worth doing even if it had no applications. Okay, I like to say that for me, the number one application of a quantum computer is simply to disprove the people who said it was impossible. Okay? If we get that, I am satisfied. Everything else is icing on the cake for me. Okay, but I also hope that we'll get not only the cake but some of the icing as well.
Okay. And well, with that, please give a nice round of applause to our panel.